We return to our look at the history of the lore of Doctor Who, with the first story in the show's 20th anniversary season, a season in which a great deal was promised. A returning element in every story, they said. How exciting, except, one of those was an enemy that had only been introduced a year before. That was then followed by a trilogy of stories which only peripherally involved the Black and White Guardians, and only one of those stories included any other returning elements at all. And then the final story of the season was just the Master again. So, all in all, not a huge and imaginative list of returning elements, and this story was the only exception to that, as it saw the return of Omega, 10 years on from his initial appearance in The Three Doctors. This appearance has the unfortunate status of being the start of what can only be described as the Ian Levinification of Doctor Who, with the return of an old enemy that depends heavily on information last broadcast in old stories 10 or more years ago, where only fans remember. Now, to be entirely fair to the way this is done in this story, the Three Doctors had been repeated the year before, so I suppose it's not quite as egregious, but the viewing figures of that repeat would have been pretty small versus the regular show, so it still counts. In this story, Omega is given no real context for who he is, or what he is, or who he is, or why he's doing it, and all that stuff. The idea that he is antimatter and all that is just something the audience has to accept without real explanation. All fine if you've seen the Three Doctors, but meaningless if you didn't. Strike one. This story is being covered now as it's the first return to Gallifrey and the Society of the Time Lords since the invasion of time. A lot has happened in that time, both in universe and out, but aside from the introduction and departure of the character of Romana, for whom her Time Lord heritage was important to her character but her relationship with the Society itself wasn't really, we haven't really seen much of the old Gallifreyans. And well, if this story is anything to go by, I think they were better off that way, and frankly, if Russell T Davies watched the stories before he decided to can the Time Lords entirely for New Who, I'd almost forgive him for it. Almost. And that's because the Time Lords here are boring, stuffy and lifeless. The intrigue and grandness of the deadly assassin is completely gone. Instead, Gallifrey looks like the inside of a travel lodge and all the Time Lords do is sit around being grumpy and stuffy. The grandeur's gone, they're just any old aliens now, and a particularly dull and uninteresting lot of them at that. Nowhere is this more obvious than in the fall of Barusa, going from a sharp, authoritative figure in the deadly assassin, who then changed into a wise, no-nonsense, yet almost fatherly figure in the Invasion of Time, to here, where he's a lifeless, crusty bureaucrat who spends most of Part 4 cheering on the Doctor in a way that's so out of character you have to wonder whether anyone even watched those earlier stories. The only way it could have been any worse is if they decided to, turn him into a power-obsessed villain. Anyway, that's strike two. The thing is that these transgressions wouldn't necessarily be fatal if the story itself could still manage to tell a good story, but it doesn't. This story just feels generic and lifeless. The conflicts are mostly lame and manufactured, the twist traitor within the Time Lord is an absurdly weak and obvious twist, Omega's a painfully generic villain who lacks any of the strong motivations he had in the first story, and the way the story is structured just sucks out all the tension. It feels like nothing more than a story of conveniences and runarounds, and that's the fatal blow. It's not completely without merit, but the final product is a huge disappointment all around. And well, that's strike three. Arc of Infinity is therefore not very good. Far from the worst of its era, of course. Remember, the story leading into this one at the end of the previous season was Time Flight. Nothing more needs to be said. And in a few stories' time, the audience will be subjected to Terminus. Even less needs to be said. And as I said, there are a few bits of the story that do work. But ultimately, it's an exercise in frustration and boredom, as if it was just a story everyone was happy with on the first draft when they really shouldn't have been. It's disappointing, really, and showed many varying attitudes that would eventually prove fatal for the show during that decade. Well, we'll start with the production as always. This story was directed by Ron Jones, a prominent 80s director who I've discussed before as the previously covered Vengeance on Varos is among the stories he directed. He was in my mind a pretty average director who seems to be pretty content with the filmed stage play approach that was so common on TV at the time. I spoke at length in the Varos review about this kind of thing, so I won't repeat myself, but it's frustrating a lot of the time there are directors willing to push the boat out. Graham Harper is the obvious one, completely shattering the status quo as he did, but I'd also like to highlight Peter Grimwade as another excellent director of this time. He was always happy to go beyond the film stage play approach to excellent effects in stories like Logopolis, Kinder and Earthshock. Jones was not among them, though, and part of the reason Arc of Infinity feels so flat is it doesn't excite on the screen any more than it does on the page. Now, to be fair to Jones, not really much of this is his fault. It's immediately apparent just from the opening minutes of Part 1 the script is severely hampering his job here, as the story so choppily cuts back and forth between all the different plot threads in a way that just feels haphazard and clumsy. But that's not an editing or directing problem, that would have been in the script. Jones also does have a few good moments. He really uses the location filming in Amsterdam for all it's worth. He's almost doing the same thing Fiona Cumming would do a year later for Planet of Fire in Lanzarote, but of course highlighting the canals and streets of Amsterdam feels much more low-key than the mountains of Lanzarote, but it does work. And despite being a gratuitous because we can thing from JNT to even be there in the first place, it nevertheless feels like it's worth it from how it comes across on the screen. Small bits like that add to the feeling of Doctor Who existing in a wider world. I particularly like the small moment in the chase at the end of the story where Dr. Nyssa and Tegan knock into the Amsterdamer with their fruit and knock it all down. Whether that was a scripted moment or not, I don't know. I imagine it probably wasn't someone Peter Davison, Sarah Sutton and Janet Fielding actually did knock into and ruin their day, but it may have been invented as a scene on the spot, I'm not sure. I haven't got a script book to hand, I'm afraid. Either way, it does give Amsterdam a living feeling to it, and also highlights the small interactions of life that Omega is about to blast to oblivion, which also connects to the themes Omega himself was dealing with at the time. It's a nice little scene which shows Jones got the assignment in that way. As for the studio stuff, well, there's a few nice shots I like. This one just before the technician guy gets offed early in part 1 is a nice bit of visual storytelling, showing that it's a high-up Time Lord who's doing this without having to explicitly say it until it's necessary. But unfortunately, it's in the meat of the story where Jones falls flat. The flat exposition scenes of crusty, boring Time Lords are exactly that, while there's little excitement surrounding any of the scenes of Omega either. The unreality type scenes in the Three Doctors were pretty cheesy, but they looked a hell of a lot better than this did. Some of it also feels awkwardly staged. Hedden's reveal and subsequent death is pretty unimpressive by most accounts. Now, Jones is being asked to make silk out of a sow purse. Is that the expression or is it the other way around? He's being asked to make stuff for something out of shit is the short version. So as I said, it's not necessarily his fault, but overall just doesn't quite gel on the screen. Maybe more dynamics directing would have done the trick, but then again maybe it wouldn't. The script is rubbish after all. As for the rest of the production, well, it's not very good. The production design is pretty poor. I mentioned Gallifrey looking a bit like a travel lodge, and well, that's about right. It lacks any of the scope and majesty of the Deadly Assassin sets. The way they were realised in the Invasion of Time lost some of it, sure, but the scale did feel like it was there, and well, they had lack of time and money as excuses. This story doesn't have that, and yet Gallifrey has never felt so bland and lifeless, and it's a major contributor to the dullness of the story, and particularly its Gallifrey scenes. There's nothing special about the Time Lords anymore, they're just another alien race now, and that their planet now looks as all the other alien planets do, if not even more boring than some of those, only hammers at home. Even with that aside, it's just lazy design, bland and uninspired, and as this was the designer's first time on a series, you have to suspect she maybe didn't quite get the brief as well as she could have. The costume design is similarly unimpressive, but in a very different way. It just looks ridiculous and pretty naff. Omega has lost any of the imposing grandeur his original costume had in favour of this over-designed nightmare. It doesn't work with his character or just in general because of how over-designed and 80s it looks. The Ergon has been much commented on as a failure of costume design, so I won't repeat what the fandom at large has been repeating ever since the story was originally broadcast, just that, well, you have eyes, you can see how this thing looks like a cross between a chicken and a pelican. There's also more minor but pretty silly issues. Maxill's ridiculous helmet with chicken feathers on top, which would have been bad enough if Colin Baker had to wear it, but it's even worse because it was too tall for the set, so he had to carry it around for the whole story. Leaving aside that he could have just, put it down, and frankly the director or someone else probably should have worked that out sooner, part of the responsibility of being a costume designer is making it so the costume designs are practical for shooting, i.e. won't make an actor too tall to fit through the fucking door. There's also the more egregious stuff like Tegan's leaving nothing to the imagination costume, which I'm aware is pretty much entirely JNT's fault, so the costume designer is absolved from that one, but Jesus, the 80s really were a different time. A few smaller things. The music in my view is one of the weaker scores of the early to mid-80s, which is a shame as this is probably the golden age of Who incidental music, but unfortunately it sounds a bit too messy and a bit too reliant on the odd sounds of the 80s synths if I'm honest. I'm reminded of how effectively Dudley Simpson used the organ in The Deadly Assassin to really bring across the atmosphere of Gallifrey, and how the pretty generic for the period music here contributes to Gallifrey feeling quite so bland and lifeless. Finally, my admittedly now very old DVD did not play well when I was watching this story. It jumped about around occasionally and froze and stuff like old DVDs do. It's a shame because it's the first time one of my Doctor Who DVDs is failing like that, but, I suppose some of them are, 20 years old, and that's going to happen. This is obviously in no way connected to the making of the story, but I just felt like mentioning it, so my review, I'll do what I want. Anyway, script time. This story was written by Johnny Byrne. He'd written The Keeper of Traken in season 18, which introduced Nyssa and reintroduced the Master. The story goes Eric Saywood hired Byrne to write this story as he was impressed with the final result of Traken. Unaware that Christopher H. Bidmead had performed very extensive rewrites on that story. Oops. I have to say that while Byrne's script is not good, at least a bit of it has to be the laundry list of things he was handed by JNT, And while Saywood's great passion and talent is a snipe at how wrong things went after the fact, he was the script editor, and this script does not feel like it has been edited all that well. The three glaring issues I mentioned earlier, the poor inclusion of continuity, weakness of the portrayal of the Time Lords, and the overall fairly bland, generic, and unfitting plot and story, plus the smaller issues that pop up along the way, probably all result from a combination of the decisions of those three men. As for who is responsible for what, well, I'll allow you to make an educated guess, but I think in some cases it's fairly obvious. The problem with adding in elements from the show's past is that you have to be willing to find the right balance in explaining these elements to the show's casual audience. Not enough and you have this story, where Omega's return is treated as something everyone watching should be aware of without even a cursory mention of his importance and what the audience should think and feel. It means only dedicated fans get the dramatic beats, and that's not a good way to tell a story. But on the other hand, go too far the other way and you get the finale to Shutigawa's first series, where large chunks of Pyramids of Mars were played to the audience, killing the pacing stone dead in order to explain who Sutik was. I'd actually say another RTT2 era return shows how to do this right, the Toymaker. Setting up by letting his actions show what he's about, then a brief flashback of a few seconds to show that he has previous history of the Doctor, then a few bits of exposition later on to explain this. Nothing too much, the casual audience would get this as someone the Doctor already knows, but the story itself can play about in a way that allows them to understand what's happening and get into the story just as much as the fans. Now, there are other problems with that episode, obviously, but the introduction to the Toymaker in that way, and I feel, wasn't one of them. The Ian Levine era Doctor Who did not get this, and that's how we got Madness Like Attack of the Cybermen, where the plot hinged on expert knowledge of several black and white stories that were missing at the time of broadcast. This story is not that bad, but any power Omega's return might have had, and admittedly not very much due to the other issues with the script, but one thing at a time, is ruined by his essentially being revealed by name, then basically nothing else being given about him. Oh sure, Heading gives him brief exposition about him being the first Time Lord and all that bollocks, but the tragic backstory from his first story just sort of implied and accepted without actually bothering to comment on what that might be. His relationship with antimatter is just left for the casual viewer to guess, as frankly is with his relationship with the Doctor. We get at something, but not what it might be to actually inform his character in any way, or to clue the casual audience on what that might have entailed in his last appearance. Now, I'm not suggesting that the events of the Three Doctors just be retold for exposition or anything, but in this story the entire dramatic tension of the final confrontation is sucked out for the casual viewer, because they barely have any idea who this enemy, teased through the whole story, actually is. Oh, and briefly, that reveal? Wow, this Time Lord enemy that was being teased, so many options, doesn't it? It could be the Master, who appeared in the previous story, and that doesn't look like it's being played, that costume doesn't look like it's got Anthony Amy inside it, so not really him, or Omega. So, even for the fans, it's not exactly an impressive reveal either. What's baffling is that this era frequently went too far the other way, through over-explaining and over-connecting things. In Earthshock and Warriors of the Deep, for instance, the leaders of the enemy races have baffling and unnecessary connections to the Doctor that reference previous stories in an overcomplicated way, and will confuse the casual viewer just as much. There's a balance it seems the 80s didn't know how to reach. To be fair, it's not as if any other eras of the show have managed it that well either, but here we are. So what of Omega himself? Well, he's not great in this story. The original concept did not include him, and frankly it shows, because if we changed his name and removed the references to antimatter, there would be absolutely nothing to suggest he had anything to do with Omega. In this he feels like a generic villain, just in it for power and taking over the world, woo. The idea of this tragic figure, abandoned and betrayed, is barely portrayed. Omega rarely seems angry as lot in life as he should be, and indeed did in the first story. He's just in it for the evils. The complexity of the truly tragic figure who was top of the universe and lost everything is completely gone. There are a few moments where this idea does briefly shine through. The scene in Amsterdam where Omega just seems to be enjoying normal life, watching the Punch and Judy show, otherwise known as New Who, but Tish, that is without a doubt true to the spirit of the character. Omega's goal was always a return to existence, a chance to get back what he lost. And sure, that can eventually include conquering Gallifrey, but his first goal is to escape from his antimatter prison, and seeing him here, briefly happy that he may well have achieved that, says more in a short scene than the entire rest of the story manages and could even hope to get close to. Everything before, and honestly most of what's after this, doesn't stay true to this character at all. In the story, he's a generic villain than now else. A particularly low point was when he threatens Tegan in the "if you cooperate she will live" kind of way, which I'm sorry, that just doesn't come across as Omega at all. Now, I'm not saying he's above doing that, but what I am saying is the kind of thing he would do out of desperation, anything to achieve his plan and escape. To do it in such a generic, moustache-twirling way belies how the mark is being missed here. Ian Collier tries, but his performance just can't match Stephen Thorne's over-the-top bombasti from the first story, and helps drive home, frankly, that this is dire Omega Light. It's a poor return for a classic villain, and one that frankly has a missed opportunity to explore more with him, but I'll get to that at the end. There are a few positives dotted about. Peter Davison is on good form here, effortlessly balancing calm consideration and authoritativeness in typical Fifth Doctor fashion. And while Tegan's reintroduction to the series is pretty dubious for reasons I'll discuss shortly, Janet Fielding does great as always. Her chemistry with Davison is always a bonus. But a real star of the story here is actually Nyssa, who gets one of her best turns throughout her time on the show. Well, you'd think so, given that Johnny Byrne was her creator, but apparently Nyssa is actually taking over a role in the story initially intended to go to Leela. Yes, in case you thought this wasn't already a continuity lockout, JNT wanted to bring Leela back. Luckily, the only person who thought less of this idea than I do was Louise Jameson, so another of JNT's idiotic wheezes bit the dust. Don't get me wrong, I like Leela, but reintroducing an old companion so haphazardly would have been a mistake. The only way to do it was like how they did it with the Brigadier 2 stories later in Mordred Undead, carefully, and with the story constructed around it, not as a sideshow to something completely different. So the role was played by Nyssa, which makes more sense as she was an actual companion at the time, but also leads to some good character stuff for her, which I think actually works very well. It starts with just her and the Doctor, and this gap since Time Flight was one Big Finish were very wise in exploiting, as I think the Fifth Doctor and Nyssa work very well together on their own, complementing each other in I think ways in which they're similar but also different. Nyssa can be more methodical, as noted in her quite funny nagging at the Doctor at the start of the story, one of the few jokes in the story that actually works, but also more emotional as the rest of the story shows. But that more emotional side, in stark contrast from how she seemed only slightly annoyed the Master destroyed her home and killed everyone she loved, really does well in building her character. The significant length of time she spent alone with the Doctor implied in the story itself and confirmed by Big Finish means that she has become close to him and that she's willing to resort to desperate measures to protect him. That is a bit out of character for the usually calm, methodical Nyssa is the point. We're seeing what desperation can drive her to, and it explores that bit of her character very well. Sarah Sutton does very well with what is arguably her last real chance to shine before she departed the series, really showing how Nyssa's emotional barriers are coming down. She gets less to do in the second half of the story, but that's fine, other things need to be focused on, and the chance she got to explore her character is very well used. The only other performance that's actually any good at all is Colin Baker as Maxhill. He doesn't have very much to do, but he does have an authority and charisma that's sorely lacking from the rest of the Time Lord contingent. He's the only one who I don't think would have been completely out of place in The Deadly Assassin. It's clear why JNT thought he would do well as a Doctor, and, well, what happened, but I think he is the standout among the guest performers here, and even if it were not for the fact he would later get the starring role, he would be the standout among the guest cast. Because, well, it's not like there's any real fucking competition, is it? They're all uniformly terrible. Tegan's cousin and his friend, the bland performers, are really terrible Australian accents. I mean, wow, you have to respect Janet Field's professionality for not visibly gritting her teeth at how badly her native accent is being mangled. The Time Lords are all unbelievably dull and lifeless, from the technician who looks mildly annoyed he's about to be shot, to the crusty High Council of boring old grumblers. I spoke earlier about how badly Barusa was mangled here, so I shan't repeat myself, but safe to say it's emblematic of the wider problem. There are two reasons to reveal who the traitor is so mangled. Firstly, because it's blatantly fucking obvious it's Michael Gough's voice, but secondly, he and the other High Council characters have so little actual character to them. What fucking difference does it make? The only difference between any of them, useless old crotchety bureaucrats, is that Hedden appears to be slightly friendlier to the Doctor, as if that's truly going to throw us off the scent. The Castellans are blithering incompetent, whose investigations had nothing except displaying how useless he is, and frankly it's unintentionally funny how he blows the whole bag by thinking it's Barusa and not Hedden who's the traitor. He also has such a lifeless performance, really spends the whole time seemingly like he's bored, and when it's the same Castellan who would say no to the mind probe in the Five Doctors, so that explains that. All of this is a major contributor to the problem I've mentioned many times across this review, how crap the Time Lords are. I think there are two major problems to this. First of all, they have never looked so weak and powerless. The Deadly Assassin certainly shattered the image of these godlike beings that the War Games had set up, but they were nevertheless still presented as beings of immense power. While there were individuals with more ability than others, shall we say, the Time Lord society we saw was nevertheless not one to be confused with a weak society. Indeed, it took one of their own to really threaten them. The Invasion of Time did sort of have this problem with them, seeming like they were too easily defeated by the Sontarans, but I was ever so slightly tempered by the fact that it was really the Doctor's ingenuity that had led to that outcome. In this story though, any illusion of power is completely shattered. Omega runs fucking rings around them, as they dollar their way through finding various different ways to say, "Oh, the situation is hopeless." That is how to execute the Doctor is less a desperate final measure, and more an idiotic move taken by clueless imbeciles, or at least that's how it comes across. The feeling of authority and power is gone as these crusty bureaucrats achieve the square root of fuck all, and the Doctor saving the day doesn't feel like the unorthodox using his ingenuity to save the day, but more like the Doctor bailing out their useless asses yet again, and for all the bloody thanks he gets for it. They feel just useless, a shadow of what made them so special in previous stories, and arguably it's a feeling they would never recapture on television again. The other problem is that they're so fucking boring. I won't repeat myself too much here, given I spent a whole review going on about how dull and lifeless they are, but fucking hell, reading the phone book would be less boring than watching these walking fossils. It's bad enough they feel so weak, but it's even worse that they have so little personality when doing so. One of the strongest things about the Deadly Assassin was how the Time Lords had so much personality there. From the slimy politician Goff, to the quietly effective and authoritative Barusa, to the witty yet competent Spandrel. It felt like a cross-section of the society as it should. Now, admittedly, the story does a one-up on that one, as there's a woman Time Lord, so it has that. Elsewhere, it's just all across-the-board blandness. Either old and crusty and useless, or boringly lifeless and useless. With a sole exception of Maxil, but then that's entirely into the authority Colin Baker puts into the performance rather than anything on the page. There's nothing interesting or unique about the Time Lords anymore, and well, as I said at the start, if RTD decided they were better off dead, well in this one instance I might grant that he had a point. Now, I still think killing them off was a bad idea for a multitude of reasons, but that's something for another time, I think we can all agree. Finally, we'll take a look at the overall plot of the story, and more accurately, how it's not very good. There's firstly the stuff that makes no sense. To highlight the most ridiculous, sure, it's a supreme fucking coincidence that someone who knows Tegan gets caught up in Omega's plan that involves the Doctor. What are the odds of that? I'm guessing not very good is the answer. And well, Amsterdam sure feels pretty small when the Doctor and co chase Omega around like they're in a fucking panto or something. And then there's just weak plotting. The build-up to the Doctor's execution is lame and contrived. The roof is like being agreed on because it's the most convenient thing for everyone, not least the plot. And that's not really what a plot of such magnitude should feel like. Again, it's only really Nyssa's reaction that makes anything of it. Most of Omega's story is technobabble nonsense. He's going to thingy to What's-It so he can use the Doctor's body, but the thingy bobble will be upset by the What's-A-Doodle, blah blah blah, you get the idea. Point is, there's nothing to get remotely invested in. The mystery plot is lame, doesn't even fucking matter who the traitor is, given he dies instantly and his relationship with the Doctor was only really told to us as being important, not shown as such. The structure is very poor. I talked in the directing bit, but the opening scenes of part 1 are a good sign of this, how it just sort of cuts between 3 or 4 different plots without linking them in any cursory way at all. Now this approach can work if it's done properly, but this wasn't. Amsterdam as a location, while ending up nice on the screen, is completely superfluous as a location, and is only there to be one of JNT's usual wheezes. In City of Death, for example, Paris was important because that's where the fucking Mona Lisa is. The story wouldn't really work unless it was there, and the location filming adds to the story enormously by bringing it to life in a way that would have ended up being embarrassing in the studio. Here we're in Amsterdam because we can be. I mean, yeah, it looks pretty, but in terms of the story, it could have been set in fucking Birmingham, practically nothing would have changed. Still would have had canals after all. I rather think you get the point. It's frustrating because I think Omega is a villain with an enormous amount of potential, and how lazily this seems to be content to use him is such an enormous black mark on it. Imagine delving into him as a person by giving us glimpses of early Time Lord society, but also telling a cracking personal story that would keep the casual viewer interested. All it would have taken is a bit of ambition, care and attention, and well, those are not common in 82. Unless you mean JNT's ambition to get a free holiday to Amsterdam, in which case mission accomplished. This isn't an absolutely terrible story, there's nothing that particularly offends, there's no racist magician summoning Concords, and for that we must be grateful, but there's little to buoy it up either, and despite prominently featuring the Time Lords, there's precious little to say or add about either them, or the show's lore and history in general. It's not awful, it's just dull, and not a story you ever want to give a second thought, and well, that's maybe not what it should have been. Final score for this story is therefore 3 out of 10. Not the worst thing ever, but a few nice character moments here and there save it from the bottom of the pile, but it's got a weak plot, weak villain, and a weak characterisation of the Time Lords. It leads to very unimpressive viewing. Its primary flaw, actually, is it doesn't ever really want to focus. We sort of just waft through the plots that are the half-baked plots that are there, and they're half-baked precisely because they're not given the proper care and attention. Something probably just needed to be jettisoned, and I personally would probably jettison the execution plot, instead of the Doctor just working with the Time Lords and Gallifrey. Yeah, true, we'd lose the effectiveness of stuff, but there's other ways to work her in, and instead the Doctor's interactions with Barusa and others could have explored Time Lord society, and their reaction to this incident in an interesting way. But I didn't write it, and in fact I wouldn't be born for another 15 years, so it would have been impressive that I had managed it, eh? And we have what we have, which ain't great. Such is the way of things, eh?